Have you ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand on end, as if an invisible presence was watching you? These aren't just ghost stories to be brushed off. The tales you're about to hear are real documented accounts that delve into the darkest corners of the human experience. They're the kind of stories that stick with you long after the lights go out. From a man who stumbled upon a mysterious figure in the middle of nowhere, to a chilling diary entry that revealed a deadly truth, these accounts are not for the faint of heart. Each story carries a haunting thread, a reminder that sometimes truth is far more terrifying than fiction. But here's a warning: these aren't your typical campfire tales. The events you'll hear about are so unsettling, so incomprehensibly disturbing, that you may find yourself questioning reality itself. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Let's dive into the first story. It's about an ordinary woman who moved into her dream home only to uncover a secret that turned her dream into a waking nightmare. The house on Crimson Hill. When Emily and her husband, Mark, found the quaint Victorian house perched on the edge of Crimson Hill, they thought they had struck gold. The property was spacious, the price was shockingly affordable, and the view of the valley below was breathtaking. It seemed perfect, too perfect. From the moment they moved in, Emily felt an unshakable unease. It wasn't the typical discomfort of adjusting to a new place. It was something deeper, an inexplicable sense of being unwelcome. At first, she dismissed it as stress from the move. After all, moving into a house as old as this one was bound to come with quirks, but those quirks soon became sinister. Doors creaked open in the middle of the night, despite being firmly locked. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway when no one was there. Objects disappeared, only to reappear in the oddest place. Emily's car keys once turned up in the refrigerator. And then there was the growing silence. No birds ever perched near the windows, and even the wind seemed to avoid the house. Mark laughed it off, teasing Emily for being dramatic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then there were the whispers. Soft and unintelligible, they always seemed to come from the attic. Emily convinced herself it was just the house settling or her mind playing tricks on her. But the more she ignored it, the louder the whispers grew. On particularly quiet nights, she swore she could hear her name being called. One evening, while Mark was working late, Emily decided to confront her fears. She had avoided the attic since they moved in, but the thought of it gnawed at her. The staircase leading to it was narrow and steep, the kind you'd see in old horror movies. She told herself it was just an attic dusty, maybe a little eerie, but harmless. Gripping a flashlight tightly, she climbed the stairs. With each step, the air grew colder. By the time she reached the top, her breath was visible in the icy air. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb that flickered weakly. The space was nearly empty, save for a single trunk in the far corner. Its wood was cracked and faded, secured with a rusted lock that dangled loosely. The whole room seemed to watch her as she approached. Emily hesitated, her hand trembling as she opened the trunk. Inside, she found a collection of photographs, journals, and letters, all belonging to the family who had lived there decades earlier. The photographs caught her attention first. They depicted a happy family, a mother, a father, and their 2 children posing in various places around the house. But one detail sent chills down Emily's spine. In every photograph, a man stood in the background. He wasn't a member of the family. His hollow eyes and sinister smile were unmistakable. No matter the setting, he was always there, lurking in the shadows. Shaking, Emily turned to the journals. They were written by Clara, the house's previous occupant. The first entries described Clara's excitement about moving into her dream home, but soon, the tone shifted. Clara wrote about seeing a man standing at the edge of the property, staring at the house. At first, she assumed he was a neighbor or a passerby, but the man came back every day, always at the same spot, always staring. The entries grew more frantic. Clara described waking up in the middle of the night to see the man standing outside her bedroom window. She wrote about hearing footsteps on the stairs when she was home alone and feeling someone watching her as she slept. One passage stood out. "I told Henry we need to leave, but he doesn't believe me. He says I'm imagining things. But last night, the man was inside the house. I heard him whispering to me. He said my name. The final journal entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. He's here. I can hear him on the stairs. If you find this, please don't stay. Leave while you still can. Emily slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in short gasps. She wanted to believe it was all a cruel prank, but the air in the attic felt heavy, suffocating. Then, she heard a slow, deliberate creak on the staircase behind her. She froze, clutching the journal to her chest, unable to turn around. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just behind her. A cold breath brushed against her neck, and a low whisper echoed in her ear. "You shouldn't be here." In a blind panic, Emily bolted down the stairs, dropping the journal as she ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, standing in the driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. When Mark arrived home, she recounted everything. Skeptical but concerned, Mark decided to investigate the attic himself. He found the trunk and its contents exactly as Emily had described. But the photographs, the ones with the strange man, were gone. The couple moved out within a week, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emily refused to return, but Mark later admitted that he sometimes felt a presence in the house too, though he never mentioned it to her. Years later, Emily stumbled upon a news article about the house. It detailed the mysterious deaths of Clara and her family, who were found locked inside the attic. The cause of death was never determined. The house has remained abandoned ever since, and neighbors whisper about the watcher. They say he still roams the property, waiting for his next victims. The silent passenger on a cold, rainy night in November, Daniel, a long-haul truck driver, was driving a desolate stretch of highway, the kind of road that seems to stretch endlessly into the dark, with nothing but the occasional flicker of a distant light to remind you that the world isn't entirely empty. For Daniel, this was routine. He had been driving for over 15 years and had grown used to the solitude of the open road. But this night felt different. He just couldn't put his finger on why. The rain pelted his windshield, his wipers working overtime to maintain a semblance of visibility. The radio had cut out hours ago, leaving him with nothing but the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of raindrops. As he glanced at his rearview mirror out of habit, he caught a glimpse of something or someone in the back of his cab. His heart skipped a beat. It was a shadowy figure, just barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. He quickly turned his head, but the cab was empty. "Must be the rain playing tricks on me," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the creeping unease. But the image lingered in his mind, that dark, shapeless form sitting unnaturally still. The rain began to lighten as Daniel reached a small rest stop. It was nothing more than a gas station with a flickering neon sign and a few parked cars. He pulled in to stretch his legs and grab a cup of coffee. The clerk behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes, barely acknowledged him as he poured his drink. As he paid, she glanced at him and asked, "You traveling alone tonight?" Daniel paused, confused by the question. "Yeah, just me." She hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the truck. "You sure about that?" she asked, her voice low. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He forced a laugh, dismissing her comment as small-town quirkiness. "Pretty sure. Thanks for the coffee," he said, heading back to his truck. But her words echoed in his mind as he climbed back into the cab. As the miles stretched on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Daniel kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again. By the time he reached a heavily wooded area, the rain had stopped, leaving the road slick and gleaming under his headlights. The darkness outside seemed thicker here, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the cab, startling Daniel. He reached to turn it off, but a voice cut through the noise, a soft, barely audible whisper. It sounded like his name. "Daniel," he froze, his hand hovering over the dial. "Who's there?" he said aloud, his voice shaking. The whisper came again, this time clearer, but no less chilling. "You're not alone." Panic set in. Daniel slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt in the middle of the empty road. He turned on the cabin lights and checked every inch of the truck. There was no one there. The only sound was the hum of the engine and his own ragged breathing. He sat back in his seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Get it together, man," he muttered. But as he prepared to start driving again, he felt a faint pressure on the back of his seat, as if someone was leaning against it. His blood ran cold. Without thinking, Daniel threw open the door and jumped out, leaving the truck idling in the middle of the road. He stood there in the darkness, his heart pounding as he stared up at the cab. Nothing. It was empty. But he couldn't bring himself to get back inside. Minutes passed. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, he decided to call for help. He reached for his phone, but it was gone. He knew he'd left it on the dashboard, but now it was nowhere to be found. Then he saw it. In the dim glow of the truck's interior light, he caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a face, pale, expressionless, staring back at him. It was there for only a moment before disappearing into the shadows. Daniel didn't think. He ran, leaving the truck and everything in it behind. He sprinted down the road until he saw the faint glow of another gas station in the distance. By the time he stumbled inside, out of breath and soaked with sweat, the clerk behind the counter gave him a wary look. "You okay, buddy?" The man asked. "There's someone in my truck," Daniel stammered, his voice barely audible. "I saw them. They were in the mirror." The clerk frowned. "Been here all night. You're the first person I've seen in hours," Daniel insisted. But when the police arrived and searched the truck, they found nothing. His phone was sitting on the dashboard, right where he'd left it, and the cab was empty. There was no sign of anyone or anything inside. Daniel quit his job a week later. He refused to drive long distances, and he never traveled alone again. To this day, he can't explain what happened that night, but he's certain of one thing: someone or something was with him in that truck, and it didn't want to be seen. The woman at the window when Sarah moved into her new apartment, she thought it was the perfect start to a new chapter. The building was old but charming, with large windows that overlooked the bustling city street below. It was everything she had dreamed of until she noticed the woman. It started on her third night there. Sarah was unpacking boxes late into the evening when she glanced out the window. Across the narrow alleyway was another apartment building, its windows dark, except for one. A single light shone from a unit directly opposite hers. In the window stood a woman, her silhouette framed by the soft glow behind her. At first, Sarah thought nothing of it. The woman was likely just another tenant, maybe taking a break from her own busy day. But as Sarah went about her unpacking, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was watching her. Every time she glanced back, the figure remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Uneasy but trying to rationalize, Sarah decided to wave. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, her face obscured by the distance and the dim light. Sarah closed her blinds, dismissing it as her imagination running wild. The next morning, Sarah decided to investigate. Over coffee, she casually asked the building superintendent about the neighbors across the alley. He furrowed his brow and shook his head. "That building's been empty for years," he said, condemned. "No one's lived there since the fire." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't have seen someone there. It wasn't possible. Yet, the image of the woman standing in the window was burned into her mind. Determined to prove herself wrong, Sarah walked across the street later that day and found the building. The front doors were boarded up, the windows shattered and covered in grime. Whatever she had seen, it wasn't from that building, or at least it shouldn't have been. That night, Sarah couldn't resist looking out the window again. She pulled the blinds aside, her heart pounding in her chest. The light was on, just as it had been the night before, and the woman was there, still watching her. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the shadows of the room, were other figures, tall, dark shapes that seemed to shift and move as Sarah stared. Her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone and took a picture of the window, her hands trembling as she snapped the shot. When she looked at the screen, the window was empty. The light was off, and the room appeared dark and abandoned. But when she looked back with her own eyes, The woman and the figures were still there, staring at her. Panic set in. Sarah closed the blinds and locked the windows, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. She spent the rest of the night on the couch, the TV blaring to drown out the silence. Over the next week, the sightings continued. Every night, the light in the window would flicker on, and the woman would appear, always in the same spot, always staring. Sarah began to dread the evenings, pulling her blinds shut as soon as the sun went down. But even with the blinds closed, she felt the weight of those unseen eyes on her. Then, one night, the woman wasn't in the window. The light was off and the room was dark. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a sense of relief. She went to bed early, hoping to finally get a good night's sleep. At 3 a.m, she woke to a faint tapping sound. It was soft, rhythmic, and coming from the window. Her stomach dropped as she sat up, her eyes darting to the blinds. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was a steady pounding. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Sarah pulled the blinds aside. The woman was there on her side of the window. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black as coal. She pressed her hand against the glass, her fingers long and thin, her nails cracked and yellowed, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she leaned closer, her breath fogging the window. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of boxes. When she looked again, the woman was gone. The blinds fluttered back into place. The tapping ceased, and the room was silent. But on the glass, in the faint light of the street lamp outside, she could see it. The imprint of a hand smeared across the window. The next morning, Sarah packed her belongings and left the apartment. She didn't care about breaking her lease or losing her deposit. She just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. Months later, she heard rumors about the building across the alley. The fire that had condemned it had started in the very unit where Sarah had seen the light. According to the stories, a woman had died there, trapped behind the window, watching, helplessly as the flames consumed her. Some say she still watches, waiting for someone to notice her, waiting for someone to see her smile. The vanishing roommate, it was the first week of college, and Megan was thrilled to start her new life away from home. She had been assigned a roommate, a quiet girl named Claire. From the moment they met, Claire seemed reserved, almost shy, but polite enough. Megan figured she would warm up with time, so she didn't think much of it. Their dorm room was small but cozy, with 2 twin beds, a shared desk, and a single window overlooking the quad. Megan had decorated her side with string lights, photos of family and friends, and a fluffy throw blanket. Claire's side, by contrast, was stark. Her bed was neatly made with plain white sheets, and the only personal item she kept was a single notebook on her desk, which she guarded carefully. Megan once asked about it, but Claire had simply shrugged and said, "Just some thoughts." The first few nights passed without incident. Megan would stay up late texting friends or scrolling through social media while Claire went to bed early, always turning off the lights and slipping under her blanket without a word. The silence between them was awkward but manageable. Megan figured they just needed time to adjust. On the 3rd night, everything changed. Megan returned from a late-night study session at the library to find Claire sitting on her bed, staring at the wall. Her posture was unnaturally stiff, her head tilted downward, and her long hair fell in curtains around her face. The room was eerily quiet. Even the faint hum of the dorm's central air seemed to have stopped. "Hey, Claire," Megan said softly, trying not to startle her. "Everything okay?" Claire didn't respond. Megan hesitated, her unease growing. "Claire?" she said again, louder this time. Slowly, Claire turned her head, just enough for Megan to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips slightly parted as though she were about to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she lay down without a word and pulled the blanket over her head. Megan stood frozen, her skin crawling. Something about the way Claire moved felt wrong, jerky and mechanical, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. Shaking her head, Megan climbed into her own bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, keeping one eye on Claire's still figure. She eventually drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of Claire. staring at her with lifeless eyes. The next morning, Claire was gone. Her bed was neatly made, and her side of the room looked untouched. Megan assumed she had an early class, but as the hours passed, Claire didn't return. By evening, Megan was starting to worry. She mentioned it to her IA Jenna, a friendly junior who promised to look into it. When Jenna came back later, her expression was puzzled. "There's no one named Claire assigned to this room," she said. "You're supposed to have a single." Megan's stomach dropped. "That's impossible," she stammered. "She's been here since I moved in." Jenna shrugged. "I checked the housing records. Maybe she was visiting someone else and got the wrong room. Let me know if she comes back." That night, Megan locked the door and kept the lights on. She tried to focus on her homework, but every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside set her nerves on edge. As the hours dragged on, her eyes kept drifting to Claire's empty bed. The neatly made blanket seemed to mock her, as if daring her to question what she had seen. At around 2 a.m., Megan woke to the sound of soft humming. It was faint, almost melodic, but it sent chills down her spine. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and scanned the room. The humming grew louder, and Megan's gaze landed on Claire's bed. The blanket was no longer smooth. There was a shape beneath it, a figure lying perfectly still. "Claire," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. The humming stopped. Megan froze, every muscle in her body tensing. Slowly, the blanket began to shift. The shape beneath it sat up, the fabric falling away to reveal Claire's face, or what was left of it. Her skin was pale and waxy, her eyes sunken and lifeless. She smiled, her teeth sharp and jagged, as though her mouth had been carved into a permanent grin. "You're not supposed to be here," Claire said, her voice low and distorted. "This is my room." Megan screamed and bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as Claire's figure began to rise from the bed. The air grew icy, and Megan felt a hand brush her shoulder just as she threw the door open and sprinted down the hall. She didn't stop running until she reached the lounge, where she collapsed onto a couch, shaking and gasping for breath. Jenna found her there the next morning, pale and trembling. Megan explained everything, her words spilling out in a frantic rush. Jenna listened carefully, her face growing more serious with every detail. "You should transfer rooms," she said finally. "I'll help you file the request." Megan didn't need convincing. She packed her belongings that day and moved to a different dorm. Housing officials dismissed her story as stress-induced hallucinations, a result of adjusting to college life. Megan didn't argue. She just wanted to forget, but curiosity gnawed at her. A week later, she searched online for any information about her old dorm. What she found left her breathless. Years earlier, a student named Claire had lived in her room. Claire was quiet and reserved, much like the girl Megan had met. But after weeks of isolation, Claire had taken her own life in the dorm room. Her body was found by her roommate, who transferred immediately after the incident. Megan's research revealed more unsettling details. Other students who had lived in the room reported strange occurrences, cold spots, the sound of humming at night, and the eerie sensation of being watched. One girl even claimed to have seen Claire sitting on the bed, staring at the wall, just as Megan had. Megan never returned to that building, but the whispers about Claire persisted. Students spoke of her shadowy figure appearing in the middle of the night, humming softly, and her chilling words echoing in the darkness. "This is my room." The disappearing road, it was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A group of friends, Emma, Jack, Mia, and David, had rented a cabin deep in the woods. They planned to spend the weekend hiking, playing games, and unwinding from their stressful city lives. The trip was off to a great start. The drive up had been filled with laughter and music, and the cabin, though rustic, was charming and well-stocked. On their second evening, after a long day of hiking, the group sat around a campfire, swapping ghost stories. The night was cool and quiet, the stars above shining brightly against the inky black sky. As the fire crackled, Mia suggested they go for a drive. "Let's explore," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's the perfect night for an adventure." The others hesitated at first. It was nearly midnight, and the narrow mountain roads were pitch black. But Mia's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon they all piled into Jack's SUV. He took the driver's seat, with Emma beside him and Mia and David in the back. They drove aimlessly for a while, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the road twisted and turned. The forest seemed endless, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. Jack kept the mood light, cracking jokes and turning up the music, but a sense of unease slowly crept into the car. The road felt too empty, too quiet. "Have we seen any other cars?" Emma asked after a while, her voice breaking the silence. Jack shook his head. "Not a single one, but it's late. Probably no one else is dumb enough to be out here." They all laughed nervously, but the tension lingered. The road began to narrow, the asphalt giving way to gravel. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faint light of the moon. "Maybe we should head back," David suggested, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 1 a.m. "We don't want to get lost." Jack nodded, and he slowed the car to make a U-turn. But as he turned the wheel, the headlights illuminated something up ahead, a fork in the road. That hadn't been there before. Both paths looked identical, winding into the darkness with no signs or landmarks to indicate where they led. "Which way did we come from?" Mia asked, leaning forward in her seat. Jack frowned. "I don't know. I didn't see this fork on the way here." The group debated for a moment before deciding to take the right path. Jack drove cautiously, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The road seemed endless, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. The air inside the car grew heavy, and even the music seemed muted, as if the trees were swallowing the sound. Suddenly, the headlights caught something on the side of the road, a figure standing perfectly still. It was a man, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move as the car passed, his head slowly turning to follow them. "Did you see that?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Jack replied, his eyes fixed on the road. "Let's just keep going." But the tension in the car was palpable now. No one spoke, their eyes darting to the windows, half expecting to see the man again. And then they did. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road, forcing Jack to slam on the brakes. The man stood motionless, his face still hidden, but his presence was unnerving. "What the hell is he doing?" Jack muttered, his voice tinged with fear. Before anyone could answer, the headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The group screamed, panic erupting in the confined space of the car. Jack frantically turned the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. "Lock the doors!" Mia shouted, her voice trembling. They obeyed, the sound of the locks clicking unnaturally loud in the silence. The man was gone. When the headlights flickered back to life, the road ahead was empty. Jack wasted no time. He restarted the car and sped down the road, his hands shaking on the wheel. But something was wrong. The road was changing. The gravel beneath the tires became smoother, almost like polished stone. The trees on either side looked different, their trunks gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to seep onto the road. "Where are we?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer. He didn't know. The road ahead stretched endlessly, with no signs, no markers. Nothing to indicate where they were, or if they were even still in the same forest. Then, the car came to an abrupt stop. The road simply ended, dropping off into a void of swirling mist. "No way," Jack said, his voice breaking. He put the car in reverse, but when he turned the wheel, the road behind them had vanished. It was as if they were trapped in a pocket of darkness, surrounded by fog and silence. "What do we do?" David asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, the car's engine died again. This time, it didn't restart. The headlights dimmed, leaving them in complete darkness. And then they heard a low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal coming from the trees. "Don't get out," Jack warned, his voice a harsh whisper, but it was too late. Mia had already opened her door. "I see something," she said, stepping out into the fog. "Mia, no!" Emma shouted, but her friend disappeared into the mist. Her footsteps faded, leaving only silence behind. Minutes passed like hours. Then they heard Mia scream. Jack didn't wait. He turned the key again, and miraculously, the car roared to life. He floored the gas, ignoring the drop-off ahead. But instead of falling, the car shot forward, the fog parting like a curtain to reveal the original road. When they finally reached the cabin, Mia was gone. They called the police, but no trace of her was ever found. To this day, Emma, Jack, and David can't explain what happened that night or how they escaped the disappearing road. And there you have it, 5 stories that remind us the line between reality and the supernatural is thinner than we'd like to believe. Whether it's the chilling presence of a stranger, the haunting echo of a forgotten tragedy, or the mysteries hidden in the darkness, these tales serve as a stark reminder. The scariest things are often the ones we cannot explain. But what do you think? Do you believe in the unseen forces that linger just out of reach, waiting to make their presence known? Or are these stories simply the product of overactive imaginations? Whatever your beliefs, one thing is certain: these stories are hard to forget. Before you go, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Who knows? The next story might be yours. Sleep tight if you can.